The GPS device lay half buried in red sand, its cracked screen still flickering weakly in the harsh Australian sun. I almost walked past it during my routine patrol near Uluru's eastern approach, but something about the way the light caught its surface made me stop. The brand was unfamiliar. Romanian text scrolled across the display in a language I couldn't read, though the coordinates were universal enough. What made my skin crawl wasn't the device itself, but the impossible zigzag pattern traced across its digital map. No human being could have traveled that route and survived. The track showed movement through areas where I knew, with 23 years of ranger experience, there was nothing but hostile desert and uncharted ravines. Yet someone had. The GPS belonged to Andrei Popescu, though I wouldn't learn his name until 3 hours later, when I found him collapsed against a ghost gum tree 2 kilometers from where his device had fallen. He was conscious but barely, his lips cracked like old leather, speaking in rapid Romanian, punctuated by delirious English phrases about impossible coordinates and grandfather's water signs. His condition should have been fatal, 6 days alone in the outback during one of our harshest heat waves on record. Instead, he was dehydrated but stable, almost as if something had been guiding him to exactly the right places to survive. The medical team from Uluru arrived within the hour, and while they worked to rehydrate Andrei, I studied his GPS device more carefully. The track log showed a pattern that defied everything I knew about this landscape. According to the device, he'd somehow navigated through Devil's Canyon, a formation that doesn't exist on any official map, and spent 2 nights at coordinates that should have placed him in the middle of a sheer rock face. Most disturbing of all, the elevation reading suggested he'd climbed formations that our satellite surveys insisted weren't there. 3 days later, when Andrei was strong enough to talk coherently, I sat beside his hospital bed in Alice Springs with a notebook full of questions. His English was heavily accented but precise, and his dark eyes held a peculiar mixture of gratitude and bewilderment that I'd seen before in survivors of impossible situations. He kept turning his recovered GPS device over in his hands, studying it as if it might reveal its secrets. "You want to know how I survived," he said, "not really a question. I want to know this also. When I think about those 6 days, it feels like remembering someone else's dream. But I will tell you what I remember. And maybe together we can understand what happened out there." He paused, touching his temple where dehydration had left him with persistent headaches. "The strange thing is, I think my GPS saved my life by breaking in exactly the right way. But that's impossible, yes? Technology cannot know what it doesn't know." I assured him that nothing was impossible until we'd examined all the facts, though privately I'd already begun to suspect this case would challenge everything I thought I knew about survival in the outback. His GPS device sat between us like a puzzle piece that belonged to a different picture entirely. Andrei's story began, predictably enough, with overconfidence. He'd arrived at Ayers Rock Resort on a Tuesday morning in March, part of a solo backpacking trip through Australia that was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime. A software engineer from Bucharest, he'd spent months planning every detail of his journey with the methodical precision that made him successful in his career. His backpack contained 3 different GPS devices, redundant water purification systems, and enough emergency supplies to stock a small expedition. "I had researched everything," he told me, a note of self-mockery creeping into his voice. "Weather patterns, wildlife dangers, ranger patrol schedules. I had downloaded topographic maps, geological surveys, even Aboriginal heritage site databases. In Romania, we have mountains, forests, difficult terrain. I thought I understood wilderness. But I was thinking like a programmer, you see. Input the right data, follow the right algorithm, get the right result." His fatal mistake came on his second day at Uluru. The sunrise tour and the cultural center had been magnificent, but that also left him feeling constrained by the designated walkways and viewing areas. Standing at the base of the monolith that afternoon, surrounded by tour groups and guided walks, Andrei had felt the pull of genuine solitude. His GPS showed dozens of hiking trails radiating out into the surrounding landscape, marked in the device's databases, unofficial, but clearly well-traveled based on the satellite imagery he'd studied. "I told myself I would only go 2 kilometers beyond the marked trails," he said, "just far enough to see Uluru the way few people see it, without crowds, without barriers. My GPS had offline maps with 1-meter accuracy. My phone had emergency satellite communication. What could go wrong in just a few hours?" Everything, as it turned out. He'd set out at 3 in the afternoon, planning to hike for 2 hours and return before sunset. The day was warm but not oppressive, and his GPS guided him confidently along what appeared to be a well-established trail heading southeast from the main tourist area. For the first hour, everything went exactly as planned. The landscape was breathtaking in its alien beauty, red earth stretching endlessly under an impossibly blue sky, punctuated by formations that looked like sleeping giants and scattered vegetation that seemed to exist despite the harsh conditions rather than because of them. The first sign of trouble came when his phone died. Not the battery. He'd charged it fully that morning and had barely used it during the hike. The device simply shut down without warning, and when he tried to restart it, nothing happened. Not even the charging indicator responded when he connected his portable battery pack. For a software engineer who'd spent his career troubleshooting electronic failures, it was baffling. The phone had been working perfectly just minutes before, and he'd experienced no drops, water exposure, or other obvious causes of failure. Still, he wasn't particularly concerned. His primary GPS device was functioning normally, showing his location clearly and marking a breadcrumb trail back to his starting point. He had backup navigation, emergency supplies, and plenty of daylight remaining. The phone failure was inconvenient, but not dangerous. What was dangerous, though he didn't realize it yet, was that his GPS coordinates had begun to drift. The change was subtle at first, small discrepancies between what the device claimed was his location and what his eyes told him about the terrain. According to the GPS, he was following a well-defined trail, marked in the database as Kata-Chuta Connector, but the path beneath his feet was becoming increasingly faint, little more than an animal track winding between rust-colored boulders and stunted acacia trees. By 5 in the afternoon, the discrepancies had become impossible to ignore. His GPS insisted he was approaching a marked waypoint called Junction Rock, described in the database as a distinctive formation visible from several kilometers away. Instead, Andre found himself in a narrow valley between two low ridges, with no significant landmarks visible in any direction. The trail he'd been following had vanished entirely, leaving him standing in unmarked wilderness with shadows beginning to lengthen around him. For the first time since arriving in Australia, Andre felt a cold touch of real fear. He stopped and tried to recalibrate his GPS, following the troubleshooting procedures he'd memorized during his pre-trip research. The device claimed to have strong satellite reception and showed his coordinates with apparent confidence, but when he compared those coordinates to his backup paper maps, they placed him in an area marked as unsurveyed terrain at least 5 kilometers from where he thought he should be. Either his GPS had developed a serious malfunction, or he was lost in a way that his months of careful planning hadn't prepared him for. Given that his phone had also failed mysteriously, and his backup GPS device now showed a completely different set of coordinates than his primary unit, Andre began to suspect he was dealing with some kind of systematic electronic failure. The smart decision would have been to stop moving, set up his emergency shelter, and wait for dawn to reassess his situation with better visibility. Every survival manual he'd read emphasized the importance of staying calm and avoiding hasty decisions when disoriented. But as the sun continued its relentless descent toward the horizon, painting the landscape in increasingly dramatic shades of red and gold, Andre made the choice that would define the next 6 days of his life. He decided to trust his GPS and keep walking. The device showed a clear route back to civilization, not the route he'd taken to reach his current location, but a different path that seemed to lead more directly toward the main road system. The coordinates suggested he could reach safety by morning if he maintained a steady pace through the night. His headlamp was powerful, his water supply adequate, and he had enough emergency food for several days if necessary. What he didn't have was any understanding of how wrong his GPS had become, or how much wronger it was about to get. As darkness fell over the outback, Andre began walking toward coordinates that didn't exist on any official map, guided by a device that had somehow begun navigating through a landscape that existed only in its corrupted memory. Behind him, the lights of Uluru Resort twinkled in the distance, growing fainter with each step. Ahead lay 6 days that would challenge everything he thought he knew about technology, survival, and the strange wisdom that sometimes emerges when both fail completely. The GPS device continued to flicker in his hands, its cracked screen showing a route through impossible terrain, leading him deeper into a mystery that neither of us would fully understand until it was almost too late to matter. By dawn of his second day, Andre's water situation had shifted from adequate to concerning. He'd consumed nearly half his supply during the night march, expecting to reach civilization by morning. Instead, he found himself standing on a ridge overlooking terrain that his GPS insisted was familiar, but that looked nothing like any photograph or map he'd studied during his months of preparation. The device had led him through a landscape of increasingly bizarre rock formations, pillars that seemed to spiral upward in ways that defied geological logic, and canyons that appeared to double back on themselves in impossible configurations. His backup GPS unit had died completely sometime during the night, its screen going black without warning, despite showing a full battery charge hours earlier. The primary device continued functioning, but its behavior had become even more erratic. The coordinates it displayed changed constantly, sometimes jumping by several kilometers between readings taken only minutes apart. Yet the directional arrow remained steady, pointing him consistently southward through terrain that grew more alien with each kilometer. André had rationed himself to small sips of water throughout the night, but the physical demands of navigating rough ground in darkness had taken their toll. His lips were already beginning to crack, and the constant dry wind carried away moisture faster than he'd anticipated. The emergency survival guide he'd memorized suggested he had perhaps 3 days of walking capacity remaining at his current consumption rate, assuming he could find shade during the hottest parts of the day. The GPS coordinates placed him roughly 15 kilometers from the main road system, but 15 kilometers through what kind of terrain remained unclear. The device's mapping function had begun displaying features that seemed to shift position when he wasn't looking directly at the screen. Rock formations appeared and disappeared from the digital map, and the topographical lines suggested elevation changes that didn't match what his eyes could see. Twice during the morning, he'd climbed toward ridges that the GPS indicated were lower in elevation than his current position, only to find himself looking down into valleys that shouldn't have existed, according to the device's calculations. By midday, when the sun had become too punishing for safe travel, André made camp in the shadow of a boulder formation that his GPS claimed didn't exist. The device showed his location as open plains, but he was clearly surrounded by towering sandstone structures that provided blessed shade. He began to wonder if the electronic failure was more comprehensive than he'd initially understood. Perhaps the extreme heat was affecting not just his phone's battery, but also the GPS device's ability to interface with satellite signals. The Australian outback was notorious for electronic equipment failures, though usually not quite so systematically. As he rested during the brutal afternoon heat, André studied his paper maps more carefully, trying to correlate any visible landmarks with known geographic features, but the formations around him appeared on none of his documentation. The spiral rock pillars, in particular, seemed like the kind of distinctive feature that would be noted on tourist maps and geological surveys. Yet he could find no reference to anything resembling what surrounded him. Either he was more lost than any of his navigation tools indicated, or he was seeing things that somehow existed outside the officially mapped territory. When evening came and temperatures dropped enough to resume walking, André faced a critical decision. His rational mind suggested backtracking toward the last landmark he could definitively identify on his maps, but that would mean admitting that his careful navigation had failed completely, and more importantly, it would require using water he might need for forward progress toward rescue. The GPS continued to show a clear route toward what it labeled as Primary Access Road, with an estimated arrival time of 18 hours at current pace. Against every principle of wilderness safety he'd learned, André chose to trust the malfunctioning device. The decision felt like a form of madness, but the alternative, acknowledging that he was completely lost with no reliable means of navigation, seemed equally irrational. At least the GPS provided the illusion of direction and progress, even if that progress was through a landscape that apparently existed nowhere in official records. The second night of walking proved even more challenging than the first. The terrain grew increasingly difficult to navigate, with loose, scree slopes that seemed to shift underfoot and narrow passages between rock walls that required careful maneuvering with a heavy pack. The GPS led him through a series of switchbacks that appeared to serve no logical purpose, zigzagging through canyons when straight-line routes seemed clearly available. But every time André considered deviating from the device's suggested path, he encountered obstacles, cliff faces, unstable rock slides, or thorn barriers that made the alternative routes impassable. By the third dawn, his water supply had dropped below the halfway mark, and panic began creeping into his decision-making process. The GPS now showed him within 8 kilometers of the main road, but those 8 kilometers looked increasingly formidable on the device's topographical display. Worse, the landscape around him bore no resemblance to what the screen indicated. According to the GPS, he was traveling through relatively flat pastoral land with scattered vegetation. In reality, he was surrounded by towering rock formations that created a maze of narrow passages and dead-end canyons. The heat of the third day was brutal. Andrei found minimal shade and was forced to ration his water more severely, allowing himself only small sips every 2 hours. His lips cracked and began to bleed, and his urine had turned dark amber, despite his attempts at conservation. The logical part of his mind recognized these as early signs of serious dehydration, but the GPS continued to promise salvation just a few hours ahead. The device's battery life had proved remarkably resilient despite the extreme conditions, showing no signs of the failure that had claimed his phone and backup unit. During the afternoon rest period of his third day, Andrei began experiencing moments of disorientation that went beyond simple fatigue. The rock formations around him seemed to shift when observed peripherally, and sounds echoed in ways that suggested vast open spaces despite the enclosed canyon where he sheltered. His GPS readings had become even more erratic, sometimes showing coordinates that placed him hundreds of kilometers from his last known position, then jumping back to readings that suggested he hadn't moved at all in hours. That evening, as he prepared to resume walking, Andrei encountered the first of what he would later describe as impossible landmarks. The GPS directed him toward a passage between two massive sandstone walls, but when he approached the location, he found instead a solid cliff face with no visible gap. According to the device's screen, he was standing in the middle of a clear pathway, but his eyes registered only unbroken stone. For nearly an hour, he searched the area, convinced that he was misreading either the GPS coordinates or the terrain itself. Finally, in desperation, he began running his hands along the cliff face, searching for some irregularity that might indicate a hidden passage. To his amazement, he discovered that what appeared to be solid rock was actually an optical illusion created by perfectly aligned stone walls. A narrow gap, invisible from most angles, provided exactly the passage the GPS had indicated. The discovery filled him with renewed confidence in the device, even as it raised disturbing questions about his own perception and judgment. The passage led into a network of canyons that the GPS navigated with increasing precision, directing him through turns and intersections that would have been impossible to choose correctly without guidance. But the route seemed designed more for concealment than efficiency, following circuitous paths that added hours to his journey without apparent purpose. By the fourth dawn, Andrei's water supply had dropped to critical levels. Less than a liter remained, barely enough for 12 hours of walking under optimal conditions. Day 4 would prove to be his breaking point. The GPS had guided him into a circular canyon system where every path seemed to lead back to the same central formation, a cluster of red sandstone pillars arranged in what almost resembled a spiral pattern. No matter which direction he chose, following the device's arrow for several hours inevitably brought him back to the same landmark. His GPS coordinates showed steady progress southward, indicating that he was covering significant distance, but his eyes registered only endless repetition of the same impossible geography. By midday of the fourth day, with his water supply nearly exhausted and his body showing serious signs of dehydration, Andrei reached what felt like complete mental and physical breakdown. The GPS device continued functioning perfectly, its screen bright and responsive, its directional arrow pointing confidently toward salvation that seemed to retreat with every step. The coordinates showed him less than 3 kilometers from the main road system, but those 3 kilometers had remained constant for over 24 hours of walking. He collapsed in the shade of the spiral rock formation, his emergency shelter rigged to provide maximum protection from the sun, and seriously considered the possibility that he was dying. The symptoms of severe dehydration were unmistakable: dizziness, confusion, muscle cramps, and an increasingly irregular heartbeat. His last half-liter of water represented perhaps 6 hours of life under current conditions. The rational decision was to activate his emergency beacon and hope that rescue services could locate him before complete system failure. But the beacon, like his other electronic devices, had mysteriously stopped functioning despite showing full battery power. As the brutal heat of day 4 reached its peak, Andrei lay in his makeshift shelter and faced the reality that his faith in technology had led him into a situation that technology could not resolve. The GPS device sat beside him, still confident in its digital assertions, still promising that rescue lay just beyond the next ridge. But Andrei had walked beyond the next ridge dozens of times, only to find himself back where he started, trapped in a landscape that seemed to exist outside the normal rules of geography and navigation. The turning point came during the worst heat of that fourth afternoon, when delirium had begun to set in, and Andrei found himself talking to the GPS device as if it were a conscious entity. In his fevered state, he began to consider a possibility that his rational mind had refused to acknowledge. What if the device wasn't malfunctioning at all? What if it was navigating through a version of the landscape that his eyes simply couldn't perceive correctly? The hidden passage from the previous night suggested that his visual perception was far from reliable in this strange terrain. In a moment that felt like either breakthrough or complete mental collapse, Andrei decided to surrender completely to the GPS guidance. Instead of fighting the device's seemingly circular routes, instead of questioning coordinates that appeared impossible, he would trust the technology absolutely and follow wherever it led. If that trust killed him, at least he would die while moving towards some kind of resolution, rather than remaining trapped in endless repetition. The decision required abandoning everything he thought he understood about navigation, survival, and rational decision-making. But as he prepared to leave his shelter and venture back into the killing heat with his last precious ounces of water, Andrei felt a strange sense of relief. The burden of trying to reconcile what he saw with what the device reported had been exhausting him as much as the physical demands of desert travel. Now, with nothing left to lose, he could finally stop fighting and see where complete faith in corrupted technology would lead him. The GPS arrow pointed directly toward the center of the spiral rock formation, toward what appeared to be solid stone. But Andrei no longer trusted his eyes to tell him what was possible and what was not. With his last water carefully rationed and his pack secured for what felt like a final journey, he walked straight toward the impossible, guided by a device that had either become his salvation or the instrument of his destruction. Behind him, the circular canyon system shimmered in the heat like a mirage. Ahead, the GPS promised, lay water and shelter, and the path back to the world of rational geography. Whether that promise represented reality or the final delusion of a dying man would be determined within the next few hours. Walking directly toward the solid rock wall felt like the ultimate act of madness, but Andrei's fevered mind had passed beyond the point where sanity mattered. The GPS arrow remained steady, pointing into what appeared to be impenetrable stone. With each step, he expected to collide with unyielding granite, to discover that his final gamble had led only to a dead end and the mockery of his own desperation. Instead, what had looked like solid rock face revealed itself as an optical illusion created by shadow and mineral striations. A narrow passage, invisible from any angle except straight on, opened before him like a doorway into another world. The GPS led him through this hidden gap and into a landscape that defied everything he thought he knew about Uluru's geography. Here, tucked away in a fold of earth that existed on no official map, lay a natural amphitheater where water seeped from underground springs and ancient rock overhangs created perfect shelters. The device hadn't been malfunctioning at all. It had been navigating through a network of hidden spaces that existed parallel to the documented terrain, accessible only to those willing to trust in navigation that transcended normal perception. As Andrei knelt beside the first clear spring he had seen in days, drinking deeply of water that tasted of minerals and earth and life itself, he began to understand that his survival had depended not on the GPS working correctly, but on its apparent malfunction creating a new kind of accuracy. The device had been reading the landscape at a level deeper than standard satellite mapping, somehow detecting the presence of resources and passages that conventional navigation systems missed entirely. Whether through electromagnetic interference, software corruption, or some phenomenon beyond his understanding, the GPS had become a divining rod for the hidden geography of survival. In this secret valley, Andrei found not just water, but a complex ecosystem of natural shelters, fruit-bearing plants, and protection from the desert's killing heat. The GPS continued to guide him from one resource to another with uncanny precision, leading him to caves where the temperature remained constant, to rock pools where rainwater collected and stayed clean, to spots where the mineral content of springs provided essential electrolytes his body desperately needed. Each discovery reinforced his growing conviction that he had stumbled into a form of navigation that operated on principles his rational mind could not fully grasp. The device that had seemed broken was revealing itself as a tool for perceiving the landscape's hidden abundance. Andrei began to understand that his survival strategy had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Instead of fighting the GPS readings and trying to impose his own understanding of geography, he should have recognized that in this strange terrain, conventional navigation was not just useless, but actively counterproductive. The outback operated according to rules that required a different kind of seeing, a willingness to trust in guidance that appeared impossible until the moment it proved itself absolutely correct. With water secured and shelter available, Andrei could finally think clearly enough to develop a new approach to survival. The GPS had demonstrated its ability to locate hidden resources, but he realized that his grandfather's old-world knowledge was equally crucial for recognizing and utilizing what the device revealed. The combination of corrupted technology and ancestral wisdom created a navigation system more powerful than either element alone. Where the GPS pointed toward water, his grandfather's teachings helped him identify which springs were safe to drink and which might carry harmful minerals. Where the device led him to shelter, inherited knowledge showed him how to read wind patterns and recognize the signs of weather changes that could turn a safe cave into a deadly trap. This synthesis of digital guidance and traditional survival skills transformed André's relationship with the landscape from adversarial to collaborative. Instead of seeing the outback as an environment trying to kill him, he began to recognize it as a complex system that could sustain life for those who learned to read its hidden patterns. The GPS served as translator, converting the landscape's subtle language of resource and refuge into coordinates his modern mind could follow, while his grandfather's wisdom provided the cultural knowledge necessary to interpret what those coordinates actually meant. The strangest aspect of this new navigation system was its apparent consciousness, the way it seemed to respond to his needs and lead him exactly where he needed to go at precisely the right moment. When the afternoon heat became unbearable, the GPS would guide him to shaded overhangs. When his electrolyte levels dropped dangerously low, it would lead him to mineral springs. When exhaustion threatened to overcome him, it would direct him to natural sleeping chambers where the acoustics and air circulation created perfect resting conditions. Whether this responsiveness represented some unknown technical capability or merely the projection of his desperate mind onto random patterns, André no longer cared to analyze. The system worked, and that was all that mattered. Over the following days, as his strength returned and his confidence in this hybrid navigation approach grew, André began to map his own understanding of how survival worked in this impossible place. The GPS might point toward water, but recognizing the difference between seasonal flow and permanent springs required reading subtle signs in vegetation patterns and mineral deposits. The device might locate shelter, but understanding which caves offered protection from flash floods versus those that provided the best thermal regulation required knowledge, passed down through generations of people who had survived in harsh landscapes. This collaboration between digital precision and inherited wisdom created a form of navigation more sophisticated than either system alone. The GPS provided coordinates, but André's grandfather's voice in his memory provided context, interpretation, and the cultural framework necessary to transform raw location data into life-sustaining strategy. Together they formed a survival system adapted specifically to landscapes that existed beyond the reach of conventional mapping and standard emergency protocols. As his fifth day in the hidden terrain began, André realized that the GPS was gradually leading him back toward areas that appeared on standard maps. The coordinates were becoming less erratic, the paths more recognizable, the landmarks more consistent with official geographical documentation. He understood that his rescue was approaching, that this strange journey through unmappable territory was guiding him back toward the world of ranger stations and marked trails and predictable navigation. But he also understood that he was returning as a fundamentally different person, someone who had learned to navigate not just with technology or tradition, but with both systems working in concert. The transition back to normal geography felt almost disappointing after the intense responsiveness of navigation in the hidden landscape. Standard GPS readings seemed crude and limited compared to the nuanced guidance he had experienced in the secret valley. Marked trails felt restrictive after days of following paths that existed only when he needed them to exist. But as the familiar landmarks of the main Uluru tourist area began to appear on his GPS screen, André understood that he was approaching the boundary between the hidden geography of survival and the documented world of maps and rescue protocols. On the morning when he saw the first ranger vehicle in the distance, André paused to look back toward the terrain that had nearly killed him and ultimately saved him. From this perspective, the landscape appeared completely ordinary, showing no sign of the hidden passages and secret springs that had sustained his life. The GPS displayed normal readings, standard coordinates, predictable navigation data. Only in his memory did the other geography exist, the one where water appeared when needed, and shelter materialized for those who trusted in guidance that transcended normal perception. The ranger who found him would later examine the GPS device with scientific curiosity, downloading track logs that showed movement patterns impossible according to standard topographical analysis. The technical investigation would reveal electromagnetic anomalies, software corruptions, and coordinate calculations that violated the normal parameters of satellite navigation. But the official report would classify these irregularities as equipment malfunction, rather than evidence of alternative navigation systems, because the documented world required explanations that fit within established frameworks of possibility. Andrei never tried to convince anyone that the GPS had worked correctly by operating according to principles beyond conventional understanding. He understood that his survival story would be recorded as triumph over equipment failure, rather than collaboration with technology that had evolved beyond its original parameters. The hidden geography would remain hidden, accessible only to those desperate or open enough to trust in navigation that transcended the boundaries between digital precision and ancestral wisdom. In the hospital, where he recovered from dehydration and exposure, Andrei kept the GPS device close at hand, occasionally checking its display to confirm that it now showed only standard readings and conventional coordinates. Sometimes he wondered if the entire experience had been delirium-induced hallucination, if the hidden springs and secret passages had existed only in his fevered imagination. But the fact of his survival remained undeniable, and the GPS track logs provided electronic evidence of a journey through spaces that appeared on no official map. The device had become more than a navigation tool. It had evolved into a bridge between different ways of understanding landscape, survival, and the relationship between technology and traditional knowledge. Whether that evolution represented equipment, malfunction, or breakthrough capability, Andrei recognized that his life had been saved by learning to navigate with both systems simultaneously. The hidden geography existed for those who needed it to exist, accessible through the synthesis of digital guidance and inherited wisdom, waiting in the spaces between documented reality and the infinite possibilities of survival. Finding Andrei changed how I approached every rescue call that came afterward, every tourist who wandered off marked trails, every overconfident traveler who assumed technology could substitute for respect. The outback doesn't care about your GPS coordinates, or your emergency beacon, or your satellite phone with global coverage. It operates according to principles that predate human civilization, following rhythms that existed long before we divided the world into mapped territories and unmapped wilderness. But Andrei's story taught me that survival sometimes requires finding the spaces between those categories, the places where ancient knowledge and modern tools can work together, instead of competing for dominance. The official incident report classified his case as successful self-rescue following equipment malfunction, which satisfied the bureaucratic requirement for explanations that fit within established parameters. 6 days lost in unmapped territory, minimal water supplies, extreme temperatures, disorientation, dehydration, but ultimately alive because he adapted his survival strategy when standard navigation failed. The GPS track logs became supporting evidence for equipment unreliability in areas with challenging topographical features, electromagnetic interference from geological formations, satellite signal degradation due to atmospheric conditions. Everything documented and categorized according to protocols that left no room for possibilities beyond conventional understanding. But I kept thinking about those impossible movement patterns, the way his coordinates had traced pathways through spaces that appeared on no survey map or satellite image. The technical analysis revealed software corruptions that shouldn't have allowed the device to function at all, yet somehow it had guided him to water sources and shelter locations that ultimately saved his life. Either the GPS had malfunctioned in the most fortuitous way possible, or it had accessed navigation data that transcended normal operational parameters. The difference between those explanations mattered less than the fact that Andrei had learned to work with uncertainty instead of fighting it. Most people who get lost in the outback panic when their technology fails, when their carefully planned routes dissolve into unmarked terrain and their devices display error messages instead of clear directions. They exhaust themselves trying to force their equipment to work according to expectations, draining batteries by constantly refreshing GPS readings, making desperate phone calls that waste precious power, following coordinate calculations that lead them deeper into dangerous territory. The technology becomes an obstacle to survival, because they can't adapt when it stops functioning according to design specifications. Andrei survived because he recognized when his GPS had evolved beyond its original programming and learned to collaborate with that evolution instead of resisting it. He combined digital guidance with inherited knowledge, trusting both the erratic coordinates and his grandfather's stories about reading landscape for signs of water and shelter. The synthesis of those approaches created a navigation system more reliable than either one alone, capable of finding resources hidden from conventional mapping techniques. His willingness to work with malfunctioning technology as if it might contain wisdom rather than errors opened possibilities that wouldn't have existed for someone committed to purely rational problem-solving. The hidden geography he described during his recovery interviews existed in the spaces between documented reality and traditional ecological knowledge, accessible to those desperate enough or open enough to navigate without requiring complete understanding. Water sources that appeared when needed, shelter formations that materialized for travelers who trusted guidance beyond normal perception, pathways through terrain that connected according to principles older than cartographical science. Whether those phenomena represented objective features of the landscape or subjective experiences of survival consciousness, they had functioned reliably enough to keep him alive through 6 days that should have killed him. I started incorporating some of his insights into the safety briefings I conducted for visitors, explaining that GPS devices could fail in numerous ways, but that total dependence on any single navigation system increased risk rather than reducing it. Learn to read the landscape for natural indicators of direction and water sources. Carry backup navigation tools including compass and paper maps. Understand that electronic devices operate according to limitations that may not become apparent until emergency situations reveal their inadequacies. But most importantly, develop the psychological flexibility to adapt strategies when original plans prove insufficient for changing circumstances. The number of successful self-rescues increased after I began emphasizing adaptation over rigid adherence to predetermined emergency protocols. People who got into trouble still made mistakes, still wandered off marked trails, still overestimated their preparedness for outback conditions. But they recovered from those mistakes more effectively when they approached problem-solving as collaboration with their environment rather than conquest of hostile territory. They conserved energy and resources by working with available conditions instead of exhausting themselves trying to impose ideal solutions on imperfect situations. Some visitors asked me directly whether I believed Andre's story about the GPS guiding him to hidden water sources and secret passages through unmarked terrain. I told them that belief mattered less than effectiveness, that survival required working with whatever tools and information became available, regardless of whether they fit within normal categories of reliability. The outback contained possibilities beyond what appeared on official maps, resources accessible to those who learned to navigate between documented knowledge and inherited wisdom. Whether that navigation happened through equipment malfunction or breakthrough capability, the results spoke for themselves. The GPS device itself remained in Andre's possession, displaying normal readings and conventional coordinates whenever I saw him using it during subsequent visits to the area. He returned to Uluru several times over the following years, hiking marked trails and following standard routes like any ordinary tourist. But he carried the device with particular care, treating it as something more significant than standard navigation equipment. He told me once that he occasionally tested it by venturing slightly off established pathways, checking whether it would access the alternative navigation system that had saved his life. So far it displayed only normal functionality, but he maintained readiness for the possibility that emergency situations might reactivate its hidden capabilities. I respected that approach because it embodied the essential principle his experience had demonstrated. Survival required maintaining openness to resources and strategies beyond immediate understanding. The documented world provided baseline knowledge about terrain, weather patterns, safety protocols, emergency procedures. But survival situations often demanded solutions that transcended those established parameters, requiring synthesis of multiple knowledge systems, including technical skills, traditional ecological wisdom, intuitive problem-solving, and willingness to work with uncertainty, rather than demanding absolute control. The hidden geography Andre had discovered existed for those who needed it to exist, accessible through combination of desperate necessity and psychological flexibility. Most visitors to Uluru would never encounter those spaces because they stayed within documented areas where conventional navigation remained reliable. But the possibility of accessing alternative resources remained available for emergency situations that pushed travelers beyond the boundaries of normal tourist experience into territories where survival demanded different approaches. After 5 years of incorporating these insights into my ranger work, I'd responded to dozens of rescue calls where people had survived dangerous situations by learning to collaborate with their environment instead of fighting it. Equipment failures that could have been fatal became opportunities for creative problem-solving. Navigation errors that initially led travelers into greater danger eventually guided them toward resources they wouldn't have found by following predetermined routes. Weather conditions that seemed to threaten safety actually provided advantages for those flexible enough to modify their strategies according to changing circumstances. The pattern suggested that survival capacity increased when people developed comfort with operating in the spaces between documented knowledge and unknown possibilities. The outback rewarded those who approached it as a complex system containing both visible and hidden resources, rather than hostile territory to be conquered through superior technology and careful planning. Respect for the landscape's complexity created opportunities for collaboration that weren't available to those who insisted on maintaining complete understanding and absolute control over their circumstances. That recognition changed how I thought about my own relationship with this country, this landscape that had shaped my professional identity and personal understanding of survival. The outback contained intelligence that predated human presence here, accumulated wisdom about sustainability and adaptation, that remained accessible to those willing to learn according to its terms, rather than imposing external frameworks. My role as a ranger involved facilitating that learning process for visitors who came seeking adventure or spiritual experience, or simply escape from urban complexity. Andre's story became part of my standard safety presentations, not as encouragement for reckless behavior, but as illustration of the psychological flexibility that could mean the difference between catastrophe and successful self-rescue. Respect the power of this landscape to create situations beyond your preparation or experience. Develop skills and carry equipment that provide multiple options for navigation, communication, water procurement, shelter construction. But most importantly, cultivate the mental adaptability to work with changing circumstances, instead of exhausting yourself trying to force ideal solutions onto imperfect situations. The outback doesn't forgive mistakes, but it provides opportunities for learning that can't be found anywhere else. Those opportunities exist in the spaces between safety and danger, between documented knowledge and inherited wisdom, between technological capability and traditional ecological understanding. Andre found those spaces when he needed them most, and his willingness to trust guidance beyond normal parameters opened possibilities that saved his life. That's the lesson I want every visitor to understand before they venture beyond marked trails, into country that operates according to principles older and more complex than human comprehension. The landscape contains both visible and hidden resources, accessible to those who approach it with appropriate respect, adequate preparation, and sufficient flexibility to collaborate with circumstances they cannot fully predict or control. Survival depends not on conquering the outback, but on learning to work with it as a partner in the ancient dance between human adaptability and natural intelligence.